My name's Alex Caputo-Pearl. I'm the president of United Teachers Los Angeles, and before being elected to that position 2.5 years ago, I taught for 22 years in Compton Unified School District and in South LA, in the LA Unified School District. And we are under very challenging circumstances. We are very grateful that you all are here. And this is the first of what we know will be many gatherings to think about what we need to be doing for our students, for our families, and for communities. And so when Arlene and Ilse, who again I want to call out for the great work that they've been doing, when they asked me to open things up, I was glad to do that. I just want to say a couple of words about educators, because most of us got into teaching. I certainly got into teaching at the first of those 22 years of teaching. I certainly got into it. There's usually 3 reasons, or at least one of 3 reasons. One reason to get into teaching and into education is you like the energy you get from being around young people, right? How many folks got into education or into youth work for that reason, right? Another reason that people get into it is, certainly for me, I coached basketball when I was in high school. I always was around young people, and there's a certain energy there, right? A second reason people get into teaching and education is often the community feeling, the feeling of community, a school as a place that represents something bigger than yourself, a community and the potential of a community. Where I went to elementary school in southern Maryland, it was literally a town that was divided by the railroad track, the classic tale. And my elementary school was right next to the railroad tracks. And so we had students from families on both sides of the railroad tracks coming to that school. And we had an opportunity to get to know each other when we probably wouldn't have under other circumstances if we didn't have that school. So community is another reason people get into teaching. And people get into teaching also because of a sense of justice, right? How many of you got into education or youth work because of a sense of justice? The idea that you could have a public institution that actually is trying to bring about equity, bring about democracy, this is exciting. And certainly for me in my first year of teaching, 3rd grade in Compton Unified School District, when I took a couple of my students, I'll never forget Johnny Bermudez, who was my 3rd grader, took him to Cal State Dominguez Hills, where I was getting my teaching credential, and allowed him to present to people who were becoming teachers about his experience as a 3rd grader, and how much he grew from that in terms of his critical thinking, his view of the world, his exposure to different ideas. This is something that is fundamental to getting into teaching, a sense of justice, right? Now, what happened on November 8th, the election of Donald Trump, threatens each of those reasons that you might get into teaching and education. It's a threat to kids, a threat to young people. When you've got threats of deportation, fear, breaking up families, it's a direct threat to young people, to kids. Certainly threatens the idea of community when you have an empowerment of people in our society who would use hate crime and hate speech, racist hate crime and hate speech, to go after other members of the community. It's a threat to community. And certainly it's a threat to justice. Having someone like Steve Bannon as really the top advisor in the White House. It's chilling, actually, to think about this, and you don't need to be told that. But when we have Steve Bannon close to the president, the soon-to-be president of the United States, someone who does not disavow at all being connected to white supremacist movements, when you have Jeff Sessions who has been appointed to the cabinet or will be considered for the cabinet, someone who has led some of the most racist and anti-immigrant initiatives in the country. When you have Flynn coming in to supervise the military and security, someone who has been unabashed in anti-Muslim rhetoric and xenophobia. And when you've got Betsy DeVos, a billionaire non-educator who's interested in privatizing the system, not sustaining and growing the system, as the Secretary of Education, that is chilling, and it's a threat to justice. On November 8th, though, there was also a different story that was told on November 8th and on November 9th and November 10th and November 11th and the next few days after that. And it was a story of hope and resistance and potential. In California, we won Proposition 55. Not by a little bit. We won it by a lot. Which is essentially, it wasn't called this, but it's a millionaire's tax. And it gives us the foundation to 2 years from now go after the wealthiest commercial property tax holders in an initiative called Make It Fair that we're trying to build towards, and build towards redistribution of wealth towards schools and social services. In California on November 8th, we won Prop 58. Again, not by a little bit. Not by a little bit. Overwhelmingly. 72%. In what really is a historic anti-racist victory. Given the fact that bilingual education in the late 90s, how many of you remember Prop 227? The bilingual education in the late 90s was attacked with unabashed anti-immigrant rhetoric, that less than 20 years later, we have a victory like Proposition 58 is significant historically. So there was that news on November 8th. There was also interesting news on November 8th out of Massachusetts, where there was a billionaire-funded effort to take the cap off of charter school growth, which is a major way that privatization has been advancing within public education. We represent charter educators. I see some charter educators who I know and love here in the audience. Raise your hand if you teach at a charter school. Let's give them a round of applause. But educators at charter schools know that the original idea of charters to actually serve students who aren't served by the broader system and feed lessons back into that public system to strengthen the system, they know that's a good idea, but they also know that when billionaires got a hold of that idea and tried to use charter schools as a privatization effort, as an anti-union effort, as an anti-teacher effort, to undermine the system rather than strengthen it, they know the problems with that. And in Massachusetts, overwhelmingly, people kept a cap on charter schools. And it was the vote was particularly high in the African American and Latino community, saying that people understand, or there's a growing understanding of the need to protect and expand and strengthen our public system, and not continue to rely on a billionaire-funded, unregulated charter growth to take us somewhere towards educational outcomes. So there was that good news. The days after the elections, how many of you were involved or saw or walked with students who walked out of schools? We saw young people all over the city, all over the country, take to the street, and even if they weren't necessarily sure about all of the implications, they were sure enough. And God, it was a moment of consciousness building, an opportunity for youth voice to be expressed. It was powerful to see that. And of course there's the day-to-day work, like the center that supports undocumented students at Lincoln High School, the people at Dorsey High School who are looking in particular at how we make Black Lives Matter in the classroom, Grandview Elementary School, the parent center there, that's such a sustaining force to the school. There's all sorts of reasons to be hopeful, even in a time like now. But hope doesn't go very far if it's just hope. There's got to be work too, am I right?
Yeah.
And luckily in UTLA, one way to look at it, when I went to bed finally at 3:30 in the morning on November 9th, one way to look at it is that the people in this room, whether you're with UTLA or not, you're fortunate to be connected to organizations that can actually do something in this political moment. Imagine if you felt isolated, that you weren't part of an organization that could take on some of what we're about to experience under Donald Trump. At least we've got organizations, we've got capacity, we've got collective spirit to do something.